Canada, a partially decomposed skeleton is found by the side of the road. Police suspect foul play, but determining who it is and time of death will be as tough as proving who committed the crime. In Colorado, a World War II hero is ambushed inside his house. Detectives enlist a battalion of metal detectors and a slab of roast beef to zero in on a killer. In a case of murder, the culprit may be a complete stranger or someone closer to home. To the astute detective and forensic specialist, the biggest clues often hide in plain sight. And what seems trivial to some is, in reality, critical evidence. In this program, some of the names of the participants have been changed to protect their identity. In Ontario, Canada, spring thaw brings signs of new life. But on April 17, 2001, near the small town of Flanbury, the spring thaw revealed something far more gruesome. It was 3:40 p.m. when a jogger noticed a strange pile set among the weeds just off a rural highway. It was a horrific sight, a badly decomposed human body. The man quickly returned to the highway and ran for help.
911, police, fire, ambulance, what is your emergency?
An emergency operator received the call and immediately dispatched members of the Hamilton Police Service. Officials cordoned off the area. Detective Sergeant Mike Thomas was put in charge of the case.
When I arrived, we saw a badly decomposed body laying about 12 to 15 feet from the roadway. We're not positive of what had happened, but we handled the scene as a major crime scene.
There was little skin left, leaving the skull and bones exposed to the elements. Investigators had no idea if they were looking at the victim of a hit-and-run accident or possibly someone who had suffered a heart attack or some other serious illness and simply collapsed in the ditch. Their theories seemed unlikely when officials noted remnants of a black bra and nightgown. But it was the position of the body that intrigued pathologist Dr. David King.
The left arm was down alongside the body, but the right arm was bent under the chest. It looked as if the body had either been thrown or rolled in that position. I thought that was significant. Typically in a hit and run, there are multiple fractures, the pelvis, the chest, what's called a bumper fracture on the lower legs.
Dr. King observed no such injuries and ruled out that possibility.
Okay.
Detectives also found fingernails in the soil, a necklace, and a wedding ring.
The jewelry wasn't extremely expensive jewelry, but it wasn't very cheap jewelry as well. Even though through the decomposition we could see that the fingernails at one time were well manicured and groomed, and certainly we didn't would not be consistent with one of our street prostitutes that had been murdered and left out in this area.
There was no way of knowing if the victim was a local or a stranger to the area. The remote site was adjacent to a farmer's field and not far from an African lion safari, an attraction that brought tourists from all over the province. the woman could be from anywhere. Her body was removed from the site and taken for autopsy. Investigators hoped they could find the clues they so desperately sought in the lab. Dr. David King performed the autopsy, declaring the victim to be female. The cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head.
She had what's called depressed fracturing of the right side of the skull. That's in an area above her right ear. I think there were at least 2 blows, could be more, inflicted into the skull from the side. I think the victim was most probably taken by surprise, may well have been asleep in bed.
Dr. King retrieved insect specimens from bodily tissues. The insects would help determine time of death.
We did a number of other things to, as we hoped, identify her. Dental charting, took samples for DNA. I removed several of the fingers with skin still on them in anticipation that fingerprints could be obtained and she might be identified this way.
Dr. Shelley Saunders, a forensic anthropologist at McMaster University, assisted Dr. King in evaluating the remains.
Where the teeth are, if there's prominence of the area where the teeth are
She
held,
determined the victim's
looking at
age
the
and
shape of
ethnicity.
The nasal area here, the profile of the nasal area. Looking
I
at
determined the individual was likely from Southern Asia, that is the subcontinent of India.
Hamilton police contacted law enforcement throughout the U.S. and Canada, but there were no missing person reports matching that description.
That was certainly putting a huge wall up for us at the time, and our first priority had to be to find out who this person was.
To find the murder victim's identity, Detective Gary Zwicker was tasked with retrieving prints from the black mummified fingers collected at autopsy.
I immersed them in a rehydration solution, checked them periodically, and I tried to obtain some prints.
The rehydrating solution plumped up the mummified tissue like air filling a flat tire.
The fingers were rehydrated, however, the skin was extremely hard and firm, which didn't allow me to roll a proper impression at the time.
If law enforcement officials couldn't identify who was murdered, they could at least figure out when. Dr. Dale Morris, a forensic entomologist, hoped to determine time of death using weather reports, mathematical equations, and data culled from bugs found at the scene.
I've found several different kinds of insects on the remains. The most important were the 4 species of blowflies. They lay their eggs on a dead body, sometimes within minutes of death, sometimes within hours of death.
After determining the age of the insects, Dr. Morris simply counted backward from April.
The insects had began to colonize her remains the previous September. Came out with September 20th.
Next, I have a media release that I will...
On April 18, 2001, one day after the body was found, Detective Mike Thomas held the first of several press conferences.
of April 2001 in the area of Concession 8. We often go to the media when we can't identify a person. We released a number of photos through the media, including the jewelry, the clothing that the deceased was wearing. Tips came in, but none of the tips led to any positive identification of the person. Things we'll be doing is...
Weeks passed, and the police made no headway.
Website. We'll be putting these pictures on the website. Hopefully that might be somewhat of an identifier.
Then Detective Alan Yates of the Forensic Identification Branch of the Hamilton Police Service came up with an idea. The fingers had been hydrated and expanded from the inside, but their outer surface remained hard and immobile, making it hard to get a fingerprint impression.
I washed them in warm water. I used a waterless base lanolin cream, massaging that cream into the fingers, trying to rehydrate the fingers to a usable state so that I could develop a decent fingerprint.
Yates could see ridges, the whorls, loops, and arches that made these particular fingertips unique. He attempted another print. This time, they got a usable fingerprint. Detective Yates went to the AFIS computer for a match. The Automated Fingerprint Identification System is a database maintained by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It contains fingerprints of immigrants and anyone arrested for a crime.
At that point, I sat in front of the computer comparing print against print, doing that several hundreds of times.
Yates thought he had a match, but was too weary to trust his own judgment.
Figured I'd better leave it till the next morning, come in with a fresh set of eyes. Upon returning the next morning, I reviewed the fingerprint for a matter of approximately 10 or 15 minutes, and then at that point I knew I had positively identified the unknown female.
After 7 weeks, police finally had a name to go with their body. In Canada, in 2001, the skeletal remains of a woman were found along the side of a rural highway. After 7 months among the weeds and 7 weeks as a Jane Doe, police finally knew her true identity. According to fingerprint records, her name was Yvette Budram, a 38-year-old local woman with a volatile past.
When the body was finally identified, that was the big break that we needed. Now we could move on to the next step of the investigation.
Detective Mike Thomas of the Hamilton Police Service joined forces with Jamie Davis, a detective with the Peel Regional Police.
I've got the file in here, Mike. It's got everything that in relation to all our...
Peel officials had arrested Yvette Budram at her home on September 3rd, 2000.
In relation to the failed to appear...
The charge, assault with a knife and making death threats against her husband.
It also has in here all the notations.
Yvette was released on bail, but disappeared soon after and never showed up for her court date.
We'll have them in. We'll just tell them that we're doing that. We're furthering...
Now she was dead, and police wanted to speak with her husband.
Well, just have a seat right there.
His name was Mohan Ramkissoon, and investigators asked him to come down to police headquarters.
You're welcome.
A decision was made to not tell Mohan Ramkissoon that his wife had been found dead. There was no evidence to say Mohan was responsible for the homicide. It was quite plausible that he might know something about her death, and we wanted to explore it a little bit farther.
I think there was a shooting. Where was that?
Detective Davis conducted the interview.
During the course of the interview, Mohan appeared to be very credible, but there was an uneasiness that we all had. Our gut instincts told us that something just wasn't right with some of his responses and the way that he conducted himself during the interview.
And, you know, this guy, his name's...
The couple was from Guyana and had immigrated to Canada.
Yeah, he called himself something else, but...
Ramkissoon admitted to a rocky marriage, but knew nothing of his wife's whereabouts. He believed she'd abandoned him and their 2 small children.
I think he was from Tennessee. He said he was.
He suspected she'd run off with her lover, a man named Harum Kumar.
You know, I mean, it was all right for a couple.
Do you know when that might have happened?
She'd last been seen by a friend on September 15th, 2000.
I think Tennessee, yeah.
This was in sync with forensic evidence, which suggested time of death was September 20th, give or take 5 days. Hoping to learn more about him, Detective Mike Thomas spoke with Lisa Budram, Yvette's daughter from a previous marriage. The woman had no explanation for her mother's disappearance.
It didn't seem right at the time because my mother, she's got 2 younger children, and she would never leave without calling them or visiting them or even letting him know where she is. So that was out of character for her, and the whole situation was very odd.
Lisa Budram recalled an incident from the previous September.
Mohan mentioned that he was having problems taking care of the children and maintaining the household and everything else. And I said to him, I would be up there, I'll come and help you.
Her assistance, however, was not welcomed.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
What I got from the conversation is that he clearly didn't want me at the house. And I was kind of worried, why would he not want me there?
To detectives, such behavior seemed odd. But it did not prove murder. It came nowhere close. There was another person police wanted to speak with, Yvette's lover, Arun Kumar. Yvette's husband had heard that the man was a murder suspect, on the run from authorities in Tennessee. Thomas placed calls to the United States to find out more details.
There was no question that Yvette and Kumar were having a relationship, and it was quite blatant, and Mohan was aware of it. It was important that we make attempts to locate Kumar and get his side of the story.
That would be harder than expected. The next day, police met with a former roommate of Kumar. An illegal alien from Southeast Asia, Kumar had been hiding in a Montreal apartment in September of 2000. He'd been trying to avoid Yvette, to whom he owed thousands of dollars.
He left the country and was smuggled into the United States the day that Yvette, we believe, was murdered. That was a suspicious event that certainly required further investigation.
With Kumar on the loose, somewhere in America, investigators realized they had to break the news to Ram Kissoon.
It was decided that we better tell Mohan that that his wife's been found and she has been killed.
On June 13, 2001, Detective Davis called the man, asking him to come down to police headquarters one last time.
We just wanted to give him the information face to face.
We'll speak to you, but it is important that we speak to you as soon as possible.
When I indicated to him that I wanted to speak to him again, there was a long pause on the phone. That's when he started doing, I contacted a lawyer, you can speak with my lawyer.
And why do you think...
This caused me immediate concern, because certainly in my experience, it is not normal or usual for the husband of a missing person victim to contact a lawyer, and that either his lawyer or he'll be back in touch with us.
And I gotta tell you, like, when I told him we wanted him to come back in here, he sounded panic-stricken. That really concerned me.
All right, we've got the surveillance. Fortunately, we had a surveillance unit that was available that morning, and they were watching Mohan.
Mohan Ram Kissoon left his workplace in the middle of the day, just minutes after his phone call with Detective Davis. Undercover officers tailed Ram Kissoon to his attorney's office, where he spent a few minutes inside. Then he was off to a nearby shopping mall, to a destination that grabbed investigators' attention.
He left work immediately, went over to a travel agency. A surveillance unit was right in the travel agency when he was arguing that he wanted the next ticket out of Canada to Guyana, 3 one-way tickets to Guyana. And the flight was leaving in about 90 minutes, and they were trying to convince him that you're not going to make it.
Finally, Ram Kissoon gave in.
It took some time for the travel agency to convince him to get the next flight on the following day.
2 hours before his international flight, Ram Kissoon's car was spotted entering long-term parking. Police surrounded the vehicle. His children were swept away as their father was taken into custody.
Put your hands up on the car. When Mohan was arrested at the airport, he could just feel the energy fall out of his body. It was like he realized that the gig was up. He wasn't going to be able to escape. He wasn't going to be able to get out of Canada.
When we searched Mohan's luggage, we located some photographs of he and his family at the African lion safari, which of course was in close proximity to where Yvette's body had been found.
After he was arrested at the airport, we conducted about a 9-hour interrogation of Mohan. He just insisted that he was not responsible for this. Unfortunately, we could not get an admission from him on that particular night. All we wanted to do was tell your wife was dead. And a decision was made to release him.
And should he make attempts to leave the country again, we continue to maintain physical surveillance on him so that we know his whereabouts at all times.
Investigators obtained a search warrant for the Ram Kissoon home. Detective Dave Emberlin conducted the search.
We started in the bedroom because the victim was found wearing a nightgown. And upon flipping the mattress over, we noticed a approximate 2-foot by 18-inch hole had been cut out of the mattress up near the top of the bed. That indicated to us that something had happened in this room, and our job is to find it. We subsequently got on our hands and knees and started looking anywhere and everywhere, looking for tiny, minute blood spatter. The floor was very shiny. The baseboard appeared to be freshly painted. It was a very clean room. After about 2 hours of going over every square inch of the bedroom, we didn't find anything, and it was starting to become quite frustrating because you have that gut feeling that something's happened here.
They had found nothing. They were about to give up.
And I just, for unknown reason, started to press the end of my flashlight, illuminating the light. But as soon as the light hit it, it was like jackpot. We've found something here. Like blood. Yeah.
On the television set was the critical evidence they were looking for.
That would explain.
In June 2001, Canadian authorities were on the trail of a man who they believed had killed his wife and dumped her body in the woods. Detective Dave Emberlin theorized the murder had occurred at home, and a TV set gave him his first shot at real proof.
Under normal room lighting, black TV, it didn't really show up. But under the flashlight, there it was. This is what we found here.
Detective Bernie Weber of the Peel Regional Police performed a blood test with a hemostick.
In order to utilize this, you wet the hemostick and you place it on the stain, and a chemical reaction occurs. If it's blood, it actually turns the stick green.
The stain tested positive for blood. Detectives returned to the mattress. There was a strange hole, but no visible blood stains. At least, not visible to the naked eye. A luminol test revealed the truth.
A bloodied object or person had been on the mattress, and an object or a person which had been wet with blood had made contact with the side of the television and then had moved across the face of it.
Detectives also conducted a search of Ram Kissoon's car. Like his house, it was remarkably clean, free of stray hairs and fibers. and there appear to be no blood stains. Detective Weber once again applied the luminol.
This was located on the weather stripping of the vehicle as well as the inner trunk carpet.
DNA from the victim was compared to DNA samples taken from the bloodstains in the bedroom and the stains in the car trunk. Bloodstains from the television set came back inconclusive. All the other genetic profiles matched.
All the evidence in this investigation pointed towards Mohan. The blood around the hole that had been cut out in the mattress was Yvette's. The blood in the trunk of the car was Yvette's. That information, combined with Mohan's actions when trying to flee the country.
Police were also able to eliminate Harun Kumar, Yvette's lover, as a suspect. Phone records and hotel bills provided him an alibi. Ram Kassoon had told police that Kumar was a murder suspect in Tennessee, trying to divert attention from his own guilt.
Hey guys, I got a fax here from States here. Further corroborates some information.
We were able to track down Kumar in the United States, and he was cooperative. All the information that he provided to us was corroborated.
On August 16, 2001, Mohan Ram Kassoon was arrested at his home without incident. Detectives theorized that her husband sneaked up on her while Yvette lay sleeping. In a jealous rage over her blatant infidelity, he struck and killed her with a long cylindrical object, perhaps a bat or tire iron. In February 2004, Mohan Ram Kassoon was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The majority of homicides involve victims who know their killers. But when the killers are strangers and there is no motive, police are left scrambling for clues. October 20th, 1993. Just off a rural highway in Boulder County, Colorado, a cleaning woman approached the home of Walter Yoakum. When Yoakum did not respond, the woman went around back and made a frightening discovery. Shattered glass from a broken window. Worried, she ran to contact police. Officer Kyle Miller and his partner from the Boulder County Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene.
Mr. Yoakum didn't answer.
The cleaning woman informed them that her employer, Walter Yoakum, was an elderly man.
That door's open.
For years, she was cleaning for him, for at least 3 years. And every 2 weeks, on nose, he would open the door for her, and this is the first time that he hadn't opened the door.
Deputies suspected one or more intruders might still be inside. What they found instead was a gruesome sight. An elderly man sprawled at the bottom of a staircase. Walter Yoakum was identified from his driver's license. The 76-year-old was dead, shot in the neck. Crime scene investigators quickly secured the area. Detective Tony Matthews was put in charge of the case.
My first impression was it was going to be a difficult case to solve. Most murder cases typically are someone known to the victim. This looked like, you know, the victim had been at home, somebody came into his house and shot him.
Detective Bruce Norton helped process the crime scene.
At the point of entry to the house, there was broken glass, both inside and outside the window frame. And there was really good footprints out there that led up to the window.
Norton worked on recovering the footprints, while Detective Matthews checked out the interior. But investigators came up empty. They could only determine the obvious. The suspect or suspects appeared to have entered through a ground floor window, stepping in and onto a bed. Plaques and medals on the wall revealed that Walter Yoakum was a veteran and a hero from World War II.
Mr. Yoakum was a waist gunner in a B-17 in World War II, and he survived 34 missions over Nazi-held territory, which is, if you're familiar with history, that's quite a feat. I mean, you know, often in these raids, you know, 10 or 20 or 30% of the planes would go down. So to survive 34 missions was amazing.
The gunshot was a through and through. Matthews observed an entrance wound in the front of the neck, an exit wound out the back.
That makes a lot of sense.
Detective Matthews found small spatters of blood on the upper floor landing. It appeared that Yoakum had been standing at the top of the stairs when shot and tumbled down to the floor below. Under a nearby chair, the deputy found an empty holster, but there was no sign of a gun or the fatal bullet.
In any case involving a gunshot wound, you want to find the bullet because bullets can be ballistically matched to the weapon that fired them.
They found no bullets embedded in the walls, just a strange powdery substance at the top of the stairs. The bullet had torn through the roof with only a few flecks of crumbled ceiling plaster to point the way.
Straight down. The bullet had traveled through Mr. Yoakum, and at an upward angle it had gone through the ceiling and through the roof and out into space. So we then began searching outside the house, the entire roof of the house, the gutters, all of the areas right around the house, up, you know, basically to the entire property line, and we did not find that bullet.
Without the bullet, investigators would not be able to identify the murder weapon, and this case would be nearly impossible to solve. Trip DeMuth from the Boulder County District Attorney's Office specialized in cases of violent crimes.
Any disagreements? The first day when I was on the scene, I was did the walkthrough and was in the front yard. I was seriously doubtful about whether or not we would be able to solve this case.
The only solid lead was a partial print made by someone wearing a lug-soled boot. Detective Norton made a plaster cast of the print. It turned out to be the first in a trail of steps that led police away from the house.
Looks like it might be the same type going off in this direction, coming from over there.
Detective Norton followed the trail, hoping it would lead to more clues.
Those shoe patterns actually went out across the field, up this little service road, and then across Dillon Road to another, like a pull-out area along the side of the road. And we took several castings of the footprints that were alongside the road.
Norton also found tire tracks. They were not deep enough for plaster casts, but confirmed his suspicions.
The suspect parked a short distance away, which is real consistent with how a burglar operates. They don't want to park right in front of the house, and it appeared to us that it was probably an interrupted burglary, and once the homeowner was shot, the suspects left very quickly. They wanted to get out of the area.
Deputies canvassed the neighborhood, but found no witnesses to the crime. Yoakum's next-door neighbors had seen the man the day before. He'd been painting a fence and appeared to be in good spirits. To his neighbors, he seemed as kind as he was ordinary. He was a retired accountant, a widower, the father of 2, with several grandchildren. They could not imagine anyone who would want to hurt him. At the Boulder County Sheriff's Department, Deputies, detectives, and crime scene technicians gathered for a task force meeting led by Tony Matthews. Matthews told his men to be on the lookout for a gun missing from Yoakum's home. It was a U.S. Army pistol, which he kept in the holster found at the scene.
The family members were able to describe that in great detail for us. You know, it was the weapon that he had kept from World War II. That gun was his memento.
Whether it was also the murder weapon, however, was still unclear.
So maybe one of you guys can take that.
Yoakum's was a .45 caliber gun, but the bullet hole found in the roof was small and could have been made by a .38 special.
The first thing that we needed was to locate and identify the murder weapon, and then put that murder weapon in somebody's hands.
Desperate to find a witness, investigators distributed flyers and conducted traffic stops.
Good. I'm Officer Miller from Board County Sheriff's Department. We have some flyers for him.
We were looking for people that had driven by that day. Maybe they saw a car, maybe they saw somebody walking, that sort of thing.
But detectives gained no useful leads.
I would have loved to have had a witness who had seen somebody leaving the crime scene, but that wasn't the case here. So the only way to piece this case together was through forensics.
We just had
To catch a killer, detectives would have to construct a most unusual forensic experiment. One that involved metal detectors, drywall, and a slab of roast beef. In 1993, 76-year-old Walter Yoakum was found shot to death in his Colorado home, the apparent victim of a burglary gone wrong. It was a brutal end to a heroic life. Yoakum had earned commendations for bravery in World War II. Detective Tony Matthews found no fingerprints, no weapon, not even the bullet that killed Yoakum. Only a series of boot prints leading to and from the house.
We put the word out with all the local departments nearby. You know, anybody you can think of that's doing residential burglaries, let us know names.
Yes, sir.
The nearby Louisville Police Precinct gave them two, Jason Fowler and Adam Bailey.
They were kids that were doing that type of burglary.
Louisville officials had tried to nab the two recently in a drug sting, but the duo managed to escape in a pickup with out-of-state plates.
Okay. We ran the plate, and the plate listed to a third person, who at that time we weren't aware of. It was a man named Kevin Doctor.
We're looking into a homicide here, and I had a name I wanted to run past you of a local resident there. His name's Kevin Doctor.
One of our detectives called up to North Dakota to find out more about him. Coincidentally, he had been arrested the previous day. Of course, one thing led to another. We asked, what did you arrest him for? And they said, well, he's a convicted felon and he's in possession of firearms. And we asked, what kind of weapons did he have? And they said, well, he's got a .357 revolver and an old Army .45, which then, of course, immediately piqued our interest, thinking, okay, that's very likely going to be our victim's gun that's missing.
That was the first lead we had as to who may have been involved in this case.
With Doctor already in jail in North Dakota on a weapons charge, Colorado police had only to locate his accomplices, who were still at large. On November 2nd, 1993, 2 weeks after the murder, police spotted Adam Bailey in Boulder County, Colorado.
Hold up there for a second. We need to talk to you. There you go. Stop!
He was apprehended without incident.
With his criminal record, he already was a habitual offender, and so he had a lot to lose. He talked to us fairly quickly, telling us that Kevin Doctor and Jason Fowler had done this burglary, and that Doctor shot Mr. Yoakum.
Bailey claimed he'd learned about the killing from his friend, Jason Fowler. But when Fowler was nabbed by police, he asked for a lawyer and refused to talk. If Bailey was telling the truth, one of the guns in Doctor's possession was likely the murder weapon.
Kevin Doctor was in possession of a .357 Magnum and a World War II issue .45 caliber weapon. We needed to be able to prove both that that .45 was in fact the victim's, and we needed to be able to prove that the .357 in Kevin Doctor's possession was in fact the murder weapon.
The main reason we got this boneless is
To determine if it was the murder weapon, investigators had to find the elusive bullet.
Was shot in an area where there was no bone. No bone was hit right there.
Detective Matthews enlisted the aid of Sheriff's Deputy Ray Sarno.
We have... The challenge for me was to find the bullet, the needle in the haystack, and I wanted to narrow down the haystack.
He would need to find the fatal bullet.
We've got it in the right order because...
He reenacted the shooting at a local firing range.
And then it passed through the ceiling.
It passed through the drywall.
Okay, I'm sorry, the drywall, which is the ceiling. We needed to determine what velocity the bullet lost after it passed through the poor victim, and also the ceiling and the roof. And if we could determine that, then we could literally narrow the field down that we were going to search. We measured distances from the shooter to the victim to the ceiling, from the ceiling to the roof.
Sarno used shingles and tar paper to simulate the roof, drywall for the ceiling, and a rump roast purchased at a local supermarket to serve as the victim. A chronograph would measure the bullet's velocity as it passed through each layer. Sarno used a .357 Magnum confiscated from Kevin Doctor. The gun can fire .38 caliber bullets, which investigators believed had been used in the crime. He aimed and fired.
The shot was successful and went through the meat, it went through the drywall, it went through the roofing material, and it did record on the chronograph. It registered. Write this down.
The chronograph detected a reduction in speed, limiting the distance the bullet could travel to 700 feet.
1,218 feet per second. Yeah. Yeah, it did it.
Scores of deputies and volunteers canvassed the property behind Yoakum's house. They used the test results to narrow the search area, focusing their attention 700 feet from the site of the murder.
Metal detectors were the key to the search because we were looking for something that was basically invisible. It could have been half an inch under the soil. So we needed to make the invisible visible. And I was determined, obsessed, tenacious, that I was going to find that murder bullet. If not me, somebody else on my team.
After 2 days with no results, the search team became weary and disheartened. Perhaps all their work had been for nothing. Then, suddenly, a reading on one of the devices indicated the presence of metal beneath the surface. Within seconds, investigators found the bullet that had eluded them for weeks.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
The bullet was sent to Agent Ted Ritter, a firearms expert at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation.
It was in pretty damaged condition, being fired through the ceiling and on out through the rafters. The actual marks that would have been caused by it being fired through the barrel of a firearm had been overmarked. Kind of like if you compared it to taking a piece of sandpaper and sanding a piece of metal. It causes additional scratches on the surface of that metal. Well, that's exactly what happened on this fired bullet.
Because of the damage, Ritter would not be able to match the bullet to Kevin Doctor's gun. Detectives soon got worse news. Kevin Doctor had made bail in North Dakota. Police had found their elusive bullet and lost their prime suspect. In 1993, Colorado authorities had arrested burglar Adam Bailey in connection with the slaying of war veteran Walter Yoakum. Bailey gave up his friends, Jason Fowler, who had helped break into the Yoakum house, and Kevin Doctor, a career criminal who allegedly committed the murder. Detective Tony Matthews.
We needed to have some evidence that would link Kevin Doctor to the crime scene. And what we really had at that point, we had the weapons and footprints. And that was pretty much it.
Forensic expert Ted Ritter had been unable to prove that the bullet found near Yoakum's house was fired from Doctor's gun. He did, however, examine the specific chemical composition of the lead in the mangled bullet. He found it to be very similar to the lead in other bullets found in Doctor's gun. It was not an absolute match, but it was close. More good news came from North Dakota. Doctor was back in jail.
He violated his bond and got rearrested, and when that happened, we were able to get his boots.
The boots were sent to Special Agent Donald Sollers at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation.
I used a fingerprint powder. I applied tape to it. I lifted it.
Sollers created a transparent overlay, which he used to compare with the boot prints found at the scene.
The general wear in the heel area and the ball area were consistent with the crime scene track and what was present on each of the boots.
Again, another match. News that Colorado officials wanted to deliver to Kevin Doctor personally. He was extradited from North Dakota to Colorado. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, the suspect eventually confessed to the crime. Doctor had entered the house alone, leaving Fowler outside as a lookout. Walter Yoakum was asleep upstairs.
Walter Yoakum heard the breaking glass, and he had his gun handy. It was in a holster. He pulled it out, went to the top of the stairs, and probably was shouting down to find out who was downstairs or what was the cause of this noise. Kevin Doctor was laying in wait at the bottom of the staircase.
I was personally moved because I'm kind of a student of history, and I've studied a lot about World War II anyway. To me, it hits home what kind of a sacrifice he made for his country and in the war, and then he makes it through all of that and then gets killed in his own house in that way.
Jason Fowler pled guilty to burglary and received a 25-year prison sentence. Adam Bailey was charged with burglary and received probation in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors. Kevin Doctor pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. When faced with a homicide, police must evaluate strangers and spouses alike. But with forensic tools like luminol, metal detectors, even supermarket meat, clever investigators can outwit the cruelest of killers while preserving the most critical evidence. In 1963, detectives investigated the murder of a woman in California. But it would take technology almost 30 years to catch up with the killer. A trash bag is the only clue detectives have to the identity of a serial killer. So far, their search has met only with failure. But a new fingerprint technology will give them one last chance to put the killer away. In a murder investigation in Vermont, police have their suspect. Now all they need is solid evidence to convict him. The case hinges on a bloody but distorted palm print on the murder weapon. In cases that look all but hopeless, science finds a solution in the telltale marks of the killer's death grip. In 1985, a serial killer was on the loose in San Diego, California. The killer targeted prostitutes and other women. He'd rape and murder them, then discard their bodies in trash dumpsters. To catch him, police needed to identify his fingerprints, which proved to be elusive. On the morning of May 9, 1986, police responded to a call from a woman who came upon a ghastly sight as she was taking out her garbage, the killer's latest victim. When they arrived, they saw a sight that had become all too familiar, a body in a dumpster. This time, the murderer had wrapped it in 2 garbage bags joined with masking tape. After disposing of the body in the dumpster, he covered it with a blanket. Police questioned neighbors to find out if they'd seen anyone suspicious. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary. Homicide detectives came to the scene to investigate. An emergency unit arrived to retrieve the body. The victim was identified as Joanne Sweets, a prostitute. She had been raped and strangled to death, and several of her ribs were broken. That was the serial killer's calling card. Would the killer elude police again? It was going to be a tough case to crack. Since most of the victims were prostitutes, the murders weren't always reported, or the few eyewitnesses were unreliable. But this time, the detectives were able to lift a fingerprint from the dumpster. Detective Dan Hatfield was part of a task force formed to stop the horrid wave of killings before it went any further.
Primarily, the whole focus of the task force was to look into women, primarily prostitutes, that had been found murdered here in the city of San Diego and also in the county. There was approximately 35 to 40 unsolved cases.
The Joanne Sweets case was the latest. With any luck, it would be the last. Detectives believed the killer lived or worked in the neighborhood. 2 other prostitutes' bodies had also been discovered in dumpsters nearby.
We had Tara Simpson that was found in another dumpster that's adjacent to the Joanne Sweets case. The dumpster was located at the T of the alley. The early morning hours, the police were called here. They found the garbage container fully engulfed. Fire department finds that there's a female in there and she is badly burned. A lot of the evidence was lost because of the fact that she was badly burned. Several months after Tara Simpson's body was found here, we go up several blocks up the same alleyway. At another dumpster was found the body of Trina Carpenter. Trina Carpenter had also been manually strangled. She was wrapped in a green duffel bag at that time.
Hatfield was sure the same man was behind the deaths of all the women. But the investigation turned up no suspects. A manual search of fingerprints in police files failed to match the print found on the dumpster where Sweet's body was found. Whoever left the print didn't have a criminal record. The case went unsolved. 3 years later, fingerprint expert Diane Donnelly joined the task force to work on the Joanne Sweets case.
I was brought in on this case in 1989 at the request of homicide
And this is one of the cases that they had asked to go back and re-examine some of the evidence to see if there was anything else we could do at this point.
She learned that fingerprint experts had already tried using a chemical called gentian violet to lift prints from the masking tape that held the garbage bags around the body. The process can expose fingerprints left on sticky surfaces. When a finger touches the adhesive side of tape and is removed, skin cells remain behind. The gentian violet stains those cells, revealing the print. Experts repeated the process over and over, but couldn't raise a single print. Then, shortly after Donnelly joined the task force, she and San Diego detectives received a break. They decided to make another attempt to identify the print from the dumpster using a new computerized fingerprint matching system. Several suspects were considered and dismissed before a match was made. The prints belonged to a man named Brian Maurice Jones. At the time of the San Diego murders, he'd never been arrested. Since then, Jones had been convicted for rape, robbery, and kidnapping a prostitute. He became the prime suspect in the murder of Joanne Sweets. But detectives knew the print from the dumpster wasn't enough to make a case. Jones would have an alibi. His mother lived in a building adjacent to the alley where Sweet's body had been found.
And of course you could logically assume that his defense would be that he had taken out his mother's trash. So we needed something more concrete, that proverbial nail in the coffin, to link him to this murder and maybe some of the other murders of the women in San Diego.
Even without a print, Dan Hatfield had a strong hunch that Jones had murdered Joanne Sweets and the others. According to Hatfield's scenario, Jones most likely cruised the boulevard looking for victims. He'd pick a prostitute and take her to his mother's apartment while she was at work. He'd act like a typical client, but the evening would culminate in murder. Afterward, he'd wrap the body up and take it out to the dumpster, like he was taking out the trash. Jones was still in prison for lesser crimes, but he'd be eligible for parole in 10 years. If Hatfield could link him to the Joanne Sweets murder, he'd make sure Jones would never get out.
I believe when Mr. Jones dumped Joanne Sweets' body in the dumpster, he probably felt he could get away with it since he got away with the other two murders.
In their effort to prove Jones's guilt, the detectives would pin their hopes on the latest method of fingerprint technology. Stalled for 3 years, the murder investigation of Joanne Sweets got a jump start in 1992. Detectives once again focused on the garbage bags the killer used to wrap his victim. 6 years earlier, no prints were found on the bags. But Dan Hatfield and Diane Donnelly were sure the prints were there.
At the time that I was investigating these cases, it was my feeling that there were in fact latent prints on the garbage bags. We were just not using the right technique. I checked around. I talked with the FBI. What they told me is that there was a technique that was being used in England and also in Canada with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a technique called vacuum metal deposition. At which point I called Canada. I found out that they were in fact using this technique to lift latent prints from plastics, and that they were more than happy to do our case.
Donnelly took the evidence to the laboratories of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Ottawa. She was hopeful, but the prints were 6 years old. Would they have degraded too much for the process to work?
They were more than willing and happy to assist me in this matter, but they were not too optimistic about obtaining any identifiable latent prints.
The process, known as vacuum metal deposition, was developed in the U.S., but most jurisdictions don't have the money to utilize it. It's used more widely in Europe and Canada. Its main application is on plastics. But for fingerprint expert Pat Laturnis of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, it's a versatile process that works when all other techniques have failed.
It's possible to get fingerprints on things like magazine paper, paper towel, tissue, very fine exhibits. It has a limited application in some of those things, but really, when there's no other way to do it, and it works. If we take the best exhibit, the solid plastic type of exhibits, it's a matter of keeping that clean and then placing it inside the work holder of the chamber.
Handling the evidence carefully, Laturnis places it in the chamber. A few milligrams of gold are deposited on a heating element. Once the chamber is sealed, pumps create a vacuum.
Once it's within a vacuum, the gold source is heated, and that heat is melting the metal. The metal would almost liquefy, boil, and then you can compare it to steam where it would go straight up and condense on the surface that it hits.
A thin, invisible layer coats the plastic surface of the garbage bag. If the bag contains no fingerprints, the layer of gold will be uniform. But if fingerprints are present, the gold will sink into them, leaving the oily ridges of the print uncoated. The process is then repeated with a few milligrams of zinc. Like the gold, the zinc vaporizes within the evidence chamber. It will recondense only onto other metals, so it will only cling to the previous layer of gold. But the zinc won't stick on the oily residue of the fingerprint where there's no gold. The result is a high contrast fingerprint. The bags were removed from the chamber and inspected. This moment would make or break the case against Jones. After 6 years in hiding, the prints on the bags finally became visible. And with them, a dead-end case cleared a major roadblock.
We knew this exhibit was 6 years old. We knew it was involved in a homicide, which made it a high-profile case. And it was quite exciting to see the latent when we pulled it out of the chamber.
The latent prints found on the garbage bags matched the prints of Brian Maurice Jones. The vacuum metal deposition process enabled Hatfield and Donnelly to connect him to the murder.
The nail in the casket were in fact the latent prints that were taken from the garbage bags and that came back matching Brian Jones without a doubt. There was no way for him to disprove the fact that these were somebody else's prints. That was a nail in the coffin, as far as I'm concerned.
In 1996, the state of California tried Brian Maurice Jones for the murder of Joanne Sweets and several related crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Advances in the science of fingerprint detection had solved a case that seemed all but hopeless.
I feel very good about it, the fact that even though these victims were prostitutes, they were people also. And I think with his conviction, I believe that they had their day in court and justice was served.
The vacuum deposition process raised Brian Jones's fingerprints and secured his conviction. But it was a computer that first singled him out. In another California case, detectives used computer technology to pursue a killer across 3 decades. On October 2nd, 1963, Thora Rose was spending a quiet evening alone in her apartment in Hollywood, California. She had rented the apartment just a month earlier after separating from her husband and was slowly adjusting to life on her own. Rose worked as a waitress and kept mainly to herself in her free time. The ground floor apartment was considered to be in a safe neighborhood, even for a woman who lived alone. But that night, someone invaded that safety, and Thora Rose became his target. He waited in the darkness as she settled in for the evening. When her lights went out, he made his move. As Rose drifted off to sleep, he pried open a window over the kitchen sink and crawled into her apartment. Once inside, he slipped through the kitchen and crept toward the bedroom. When he got there, he attacked. After a violent struggle, Thora Rose, age 43, was dead. When Rose failed to come to work the next day, her employer telephoned her, but got no response. Concerned, he called the police. When they arrived, they found Thora Rose's body in the bedroom. Police questioned neighbors, but no one had seen anyone enter or leave Rose's apartment. Nobody heard a thing. It was one of the worst crimes the quiet Hollywood neighborhood had ever experienced. Almost 35 years later, Los Angeles police detective Mike McDonough visits the scene of the crime.
Hollywood back then was a completely different place as it is today. I mean, when you think Hollywood back in '63, it was still the movie industry, still a lot of single-family residences here, a couple of apartment buildings, completely different world. The crime rate was practically nothing to compare to what it is to today. Hollywood now, we're averaging anywhere from 50 to 60 homicides a year. Back in 1963, they had 4.
The murder caused a major stir. The Homicide Division of the Los Angeles Police Department gave the case top priority. At first, just 2 detectives were assigned to the case, but the number quickly rose to 6. Eventually, 32 uniformed officers and 2 sergeants joined the investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood for a suspect. Inside the apartment, experts dusted for fingerprints.
There was palm prints and fingerprints inside the kitchen and throughout the house. There's approximately 27 fingerprints that were lifted inside the residence, leading from the front window here into the bedroom.
The police officers working the neighborhood found nothing. It was up to the fingerprint experts alone to solve the case. With the long trail of fingerprints left behind, the detectives were certain they would catch the murderer. Their confidence was well-founded. For more than 100 years, fingerprinting has proven to be one of the most effective ways to pin criminals to crimes. The science goes back to 1880, when Scottish physician Henry Falls suggested that ridge patterns on the fingers and hands could be useful in identifying criminals. In 1901, Scotland Yard adopted the idea, and the rest of the world soon followed. Fingerprinting works for two reasons. First, no two people share print patterns. And second, a person's fingerprints remain unchanged throughout life. The skin of human fingers and hands have raised patterns called friction ridges, which help us grip objects more firmly. They're constantly coated with a film of perspiration from tiny pores. The curves, loops, and other characteristics of the ridges can occur in billions of combinations. At a crime scene, the perpetrator may leave noticeable prints if he touched blood, grease, or another dark substance. If he touched something soft, like putty, the fingerprints may be impressed on its surface. But the majority of fingerprints are invisible, known as latent fingerprints. They're made of about 98% perspiration and 2% body oil. We leave them on virtually everything we touch. Like film in a camera, they must be developed to be seen. The fingerprint experts at Los Angeles Police Department's fingerprint lab have long relied on powders to make latent prints visible. It's been one of the most common and effective methods since fingerprinting began. When lightly applied with a camel hair brush, powder adheres to the moisture in the fingerprint, providing a finely detailed image. The detective then lifts the print using a strip of clear tape and places it on a card with his initials, the time, date, and location of the print. This detailed information is vital if the print will be used as evidence in court. After the fingerprint experts working on the Thora Rose case lifted the finger and palm prints from her Hollywood apartment, they had to prove they belonged to the perpetrator. There's always a possibility they could belong to someone else. Detectives obtained what are called elimination prints from everyone who had contact with Thora Rose.
They were able to contact those people, the restaurants, places she worked. They fingerprinted everyone that was there. They also went as far as local delivery boys, as far as delivering chicken, mail people, newspaper people, anyone that had any contact with this place, they checked out.
After all other persons were eliminated, detectives drew the only possible conclusion: the prints belonged to the killer. Now they could be sent to the lab to be compared by fingerprint examiners to prints of criminals in their files. Whenever police make an arrest for even the smallest infraction, they require the arrested person to be fingerprinted. The prints are kept on file and, in some cases, sent to other police jurisdictions. If the suspect is ever involved in another crime, his prints will be available for comparison. The traditional way of recording fingerprints is the ink and roll method. Each finger is rolled on an ink pad, then impressed on a card with the arrested person's name and personal data. The document is then added to the fingerprint files. Recently, some jurisdictions have begun scanning fingerprints into a computer. The scanner creates a digital image of the prints so they can be added to the database. A beam of light replaces the ink pad. Either way, the matching process begins when the examiner compares prints from the crime scene with prints from police files. Comparing fingerprints is much the same today as in 1963. The examiner must look for matching points of identification. The friction ridges arrange themselves into arches, loops, and whorls. Sometimes they end abruptly. Sometimes they split in two. The examiner considers all these patterns when making an identification. If enough of them match, then he can be certain he's looking at the prints of the same person. In the Thora Rose case, Los Angeles detectives reviewed all the fingerprints in their files. When none matched, they sent a detective to the state capitol in Sacramento to expand the search statewide. He scoured every file, looking at a staggering 30,000 fingerprints. The labor took months, but still nothing matched.
I mean, it's a point that they put in an unbelievable man-hours of time on this case. And even with all that they have done, which is probably thousands and thousands of percent more than what we could do today with our crimes, they still weren't able to come up with anything.
Even though the killer had left behind many fingerprints, the detectives couldn't match them to anyone with a police record. The case was unsolved. The files were shelved, and the murderer of Thora Rose went free. 30 years would pass before time and technology would flush him out. 3 decades after the murder of Thora Rose, a new computerized system of fingerprint comparison went online. The Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS, promised to revolutionize the field of fingerprint identification. It matches prints in a fraction of the time it took using the old method. Fingerprint examiner Donald Keir was one of the first at the Los Angeles Police Department to put AFIS to use.
This fingerprint system takes time to get used to. It was new. It takes time to utilize it, and we had a lot of crimes to solve.
Keir and his colleagues first used AFIS to match prints collected from current crimes against those in AFIS's files. Then they tried an experiment to see if the system could solve old cases by matching previously unmatched prints. They chose 50 old homicide cases to test. Could AFIS breathe new life into dead cases? To find out, Keir went to the archives in the basement of the police department. There, under the dust of 30 years or more, stood shelves brimming with old fingerprint files. They were gathered from all manner of crimes, some solved, some not. One of the files he pulled contained prints from the Thora Rose murder. It was the oldest case selected. The chance of finding a suspect after almost 30 years seemed remote. But with millions of prints added to police files since 1963, and the ability of the AFIS system to compare them at lightning speed, detectives had a glimmer of hope. But first, the prints from the Rose case had to be prepared. Before AFIS can recognize any fingerprint, an examiner must photograph it at 5 times its normal size. In contrast to prints taken from a suspect at the police station, the ridges and patterns of most prints from a crime scene are faint and indistinct. The examiner must carefully enhance the pattern on tracing paper. Otherwise, the computer's scanner will be unable to read it.
Any place where I'm looping it off is where a ridge in the fingerprint pattern ends. And we want to make sure those are really clear because that's what the computer uses for a search. They're called minutia or characteristics. I check it frequently to see if I'm missing anything, go back over what I've been doing here.
Where the latent print is unreadable, the examiner must hazard a guess as to line and detail. The tracing is scanned into the computer. The examiner cleans up any indistinct lines on the screen and identifies notable characteristics of the latent print. The computer will use these as a frame of reference. AFIS then begins the matching process. The computer looks at several areas of the unknown print. It then compares these points against prints in its database. It ranks each print according to how closely it matches the unknown print. In another room, the massive AFIS mainframe searches through millions of digitized fingerprints looking for a match. In less than an hour, it completes a job that would ordinarily take months. Then, the system delivers the closest matches. But it's up to the examiner to make the final match by eye. The prints identified by AFIS are compared side by side with the suspect's print.
There can be a lot of things that match, but if there's something that you know is pretty obviously a real minutia point, like this one was a pretty big one right here, a little short line, and it looks like that might be it there, but over next to it was a place where another ridge ended. There's nothing like that over here, so I would probably disregard that one.
The AFIS system has had remarkable results. During its first year of operation, San Francisco police were able to clear 816 unsolved cases, including 52 homicides. Los Angeles police hoped for similar success with their unsolved cases. They weren't disappointed. Soon after they entered the fingerprints from the Thora Rose case, AFIS made a hit. The computer produced 3 suspects, among them a man named Vernon Robinson. In 1963, Robinson hadn't been arrested, so his fingerprints weren't on file. But he'd been arrested a number of times since then, so his prints were part of police records. Detectives using AFIS fingered him as a suspect. Detective Mike McDonough headed the new investigation.
My main concern was to see if Mr. Robinson should have been there or not. I wanted to make sure that he wasn't one of the detectives or a police officer at the scene, he wasn't a paramedic, or that he wasn't for some reason a friend of Miss Robinson's, that fingerprints just happened to be there.
When all other possibilities were eliminated, McDonough concluded that Robinson was the likely killer of Thora Rose.
With that, our fingerprint people obtained the additional fingerprints, started hand searching them, physically checking the fingerprints from the crime scene against Mr. Robinson's prints, and everyone is coming right back to Mr. Robinson. I mean, at this point, there was no doubt about it.
Los Angeles police tracked Robinson to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he was now a family man with a management job in a maintenance company. He denied committing the crime, insisting that at the time of the murder, he was in San Diego at the naval base where he was stationed. But naval records indicated Robinson had completed his training by the date of the murder. His alibi was without support.
What would sway the jury was, I mean, the fingerprints are there. You cannot deny that. I mean, we're not talking 1 or 2 fingerprints. We're talking 20-some fingerprints. We're talking them at the point of entry through the entire house and right up to where the victim was discovered.
After killing Thora Rose, Vernon Robinson managed to evade capture for almost 30 years. His life had changed, but his fingerprints remained the same. After they were matched with those from the crime scene, Robinson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. AFIS, a phenomenal breakthrough in criminal identification, had finally obtained justice for Thora Rose. Though AFIS has dramatically improved the chances of matching fingerprints to criminals, it's useless without clear prints to work from. But crime scenes are often messy, and criminals don't always leave their prints in convenient spots. In a case in Vermont, a murder investigation hinged on 2 fragile and ill-placed prints, and one investigator's attempt to read them. On Memorial Day, 1992, Glenn Michelson had a party. He and his friends were putting the cold Vermont winter behind them and kicking off the beginning of summer. But the celebration was nearly ruined by an uninvited guest. As the party was winding down, he tried to make off in Michelson's car with one of the kegs of beer. But 3 of Michelson's buddies caught him in the act. They chased him off the property and retrieved the keg. With the commotion over and the keg emptied, the 3 men decided to continue celebrating at a nearby tavern. Michelson stayed home. The group returned to the house 45 minutes later, still in high spirits. At first, they didn't notice their host was nowhere in sight. When they called out to him, he didn't answer. They assumed he went to bed. It wasn't until one of the men noticed something peculiar in another room that the horrible truth revealed itself. A ski pole that appeared to be sticking out of the floor was actually embedded in Michelson's skull. They called the Vermont State Police, who rushed to the scene. Michelson's friends couldn't believe the friend they'd laughed with a few hours ago now lay dead. While the police made their report, detectives scoured the house for clues. Their inspection of the brutal crime scene revealed a bloody knife in the kitchen sink. It looked like the victim had been stabbed several times before the ski pole was repeatedly jabbed into his skull. According to Sergeant Miles Heffernan, the victim didn't die easily.
He was obviously involved in a struggle, had a lot of blood on his clothes. There was a lot of blood on the walls in the hallway.
When questioned, the three men who found the body told the detectives about the person who tried to steal Michelson's car and the beer keg. His name was Robert Plant. He'd tagged along with one of the invited guests and grew surly as the evening progressed. The men recalled he wore white shoes with pink laces, the same shoes that were found near the barefoot corpse. The cowboy boots that Michelson had worn were missing. As police continued to investigate, a call came through about a car that had run off the road less than a mile away. A neighbor named Robert Salzman made the report.
Mr. Salzman was in the living room with his wife and child and heard the car go off the road. He came out and observed Robert Plant walking from the vehicle to the front porch of Mr. Salzman's residence. He had a discussion with Robert Plant. Initially, Plant seemed pleasant. He asked if he could get a wrecker, and Mr. Salzman was agreeable.
But then, Plant became aggressive and broke a window. Salzman threw him off his property and called the police. They arrived within minutes and found the car on the side of the road. It matched the description of Glenn Michelson's vehicle, but Plant was nowhere in sight. Apparently, he fled on foot. Police searched the woods and found him in a short time, passed out under a tree. On his feet were Michelson's cowboy boots. He was taken to the station for questioning and booked for murder. On the surface, it seemed Heffernan had an open and shut case against him. But Plant denied the crime, and the police had no eyewitnesses. Theoretically, Plant could claim he had stolen Michelson's property after someone else committed the murder. The detectives would try to bolster their circumstantial case with forensic evidence, Plant's fingerprints. They knew prints lifted from walls, sinks, and drawers had little value, since Plant had been a guest at Michelson's party. But they found bloody prints on the grip of the ski pole and on a door frame near the body. If these prints could be identified as Robert Plant's, police would clinch their case. To help him make the identification, Heffernan called on fingerprint expert John Creighton of the Vermont Department of Public Safety's Forensic Lab. Because the prints were etched in the victim's dried blood, they were extremely incriminating and extremely fragile. Traditional methods of dusting with powder would not be effective. Fortunately, Creighton has a well-stocked arsenal with the means to recover difficult prints. How a print is raised depends on the kind of surface it's on.
Basically, there's two different types of evidence that come into the lab for fingerprinting. There's porous and non-porous evidence. The porous evidence is papers and cardboards and things of that nature, and the non-porous evidence is wood, plastics, metal, glass, things of that nature. So depending on what type of evidence it is, will dictate what type of examination you do.
Paper and other porous surfaces leave no moisture for powders to cling to. One classic method for raising prints from these surfaces is iodine fuming. Iodine crystals are placed inside a glass tube. The tube is then packed with fiberglass and copper sulfate. Breath passing through the crystals heats them, creating fumes. When the fumes reach the fingerprints, the iodine reacts with fatty oils, making them visible. A drawback of this method is that the prints will disappear in about 20 minutes when the iodine evaporates. They must be photographed after fuming, so police will have a record of them. Another way to find fingerprints on paper is to spray the surface with a chemical called ninhydrin.
Ninhydrin is a spray or a compound that reacts to amino acids that are present in eccrine and sebaceous sweat deposited latent prints. The ninhydrin is sprayed onto porous material and is then catalyzed, or the reaction is catalyzed by applying heat and moisture, generally by means of an iron. This develops the prints much more quickly. Otherwise, you'd have to set them in the dark and wait anywhere from 24 to possibly 72 hours for any latent impressions to develop that way.
Because the amino acids in fingerprints take a long time to disappear, ninhydrin has been used to develop latent prints as old as 15 years. Superglue has also become a staple of fingerprint examiners. Technically called cyanoacrylate ester, it's used on non-porous surfaces, like plastic, where fragile prints could be easily brushed away when powders are applied. Superglue is often used for developing prints inside a car. The glue is poured into a small container and heated. The car is closed up tightly. As the glue is heated, its fumes adhere to the moisture in latent fingerprints and fixes them in place. The examiner can then use traditional powders without the danger of destroying the print. The Glenn Michelson case posed a different set of problems. The bloody thumbprint on the doorframe near the victim's body was barely visible and too delicate to lift. Creighton asked detectives to remove the section of doorframe bearing the print and send it to him so he could examine it in a more controlled environment. Creighton's job was to make the print on the doorframe distinct without ruining it. He could then compare it with Robert Plant's. First, he took photographs so he would have a record of the evidence before the procedure.
Items of evidence are photographed before any physical or chemical development takes place in order to recover and preserve any existing latent detail that is present on the item. Afterwards, then we can do the various processes that are applied to developing the latent impression on that item.
Creighton sprayed the doorframe with a stain called amido black. The chemical reacts with blood, darkening the print and making it easier to identify.
The amido black is a protein stain. It stains the protein that is within the blood itself. So when the ridges or the outline of the impression on the finger is deposited in the blood, The amido black is going to make that impression darker. It allows it to have more contrast with the background.
Bloody fingerprints are very fragile in most cases, so they can't be lifted with tape without destroying them, even after they're developed with amido. Instead, Creighton photographed the enhanced print. When he compared it to Plant's, it matched. But Plant could have touched the blood-stained doorframe after someone else committed the crime. And the evidence against Plant must convince a jury of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The irrefutable evidence in the murder of Glenn Michelson had yet to be processed. Glenn Michelson had been the victim of a callous murder, a ski pole driven through his skull. Robert Plant was the prime suspect, but could detectives tie him to the crime? The answer rested on a bloody palm print left on the grip of the weapon. To identify the print, John Creighton needed to photograph it. First, he'd have to make it more visible. That was easier said than done.
The big dilemma was it was a black ski pole grip, and it was a dark reddish-brown blood impression that was deposited on that. Now what I had to do was I had to improve the contrast, either by lightening the background of the black ski pole grip or by lightening the blood impression itself.
Creighton lit the print with a polylight, a lamp that can project a wide spectrum of wavelengths. The light produced enough contrast to photograph the print. But Creighton faced a second problem. The curvature of the grip prevented the camera lens from keeping the entire print in focus.
I had to keep rotating the ski pole grip in order to come up with enough characteristics within the pattern area or within the latent impression that would give me enough information to make an identification.
By manipulating the grip, Creighton was able to get a clear photograph of the print. After it was processed, he compared the print to Plant's. It matched. Creighton had placed the murder weapon firmly in Plant's hand. The events of Glenn Michelson's final hours now made sense. Detectives believed that after being kicked off Michelson's property, Plant hid in the darkness and waited for an opportunity to sneak back into the house. Once the guests had left, he saw his chance and made his move. He slipped into the kitchen and rummaged around until he found a knife. As he stepped into the hallway, Michelson spotted him. The two men struggled, but Plant had the fatal advantage. He stabbed Michelson repeatedly until he brought the victim down. He removed Michelson's boots and put them on his own feet. Then he realized his victim wasn't dead. So he found a ski pole in another room and returned to finish him off. As he thrust the pole, he put his hand on the doorframe for support. After the final blow, he left the house, stealing Michelson's car for his getaway. But he only made it about a mile before he ran off the road. The bloody prints that Creighton analyzed gave Detective Miles Heffernan the evidence he needed to convict Robert Plant.
It was very compelling for a jury when they, hard to explain or explain away. You've got your thumbprint in the victim's blood on the door molding, and you've got the handprint on the murder weapon. It tells a story right there.
For the murder of Glenn Michelson, Robert Plant received a sentence of 50 years to life. For more than a century, fingerprints have proven themselves a reliable and irrefutable way to link criminals to their crimes. In the next century, their role will increase as scientists improve ways to recover them. More and more, killers will be delivered into the arms of justice by their own hands.